I knew the room had turned against me the second Amanda Reynolds laughed. Not a polite corporate chuckle, but that sharp, dismissive sound executives make when they want everyone to know you're no longer relevant. We were in the middle of our quarterly leadership review, and I'd just flagged that we were behind on 3 critical risk assessments and hadn't updated our compliance matrix since the restructuring 6 months ago. Amanda, our newly hired VP of Operations, leaned back in her chair like she'd just solved world hunger. Then came that laugh. "Rick's too focused on paperwork," she announced to the entire Zoom grid. "We need velocity, not archaeology." Archaeology. I'm Rick Caldwell, 49 years old, and I've spent 22 years keeping financial firms out of regulatory hell. Started as a junior analyst right after college, worked my way up through compliance, risk assessment, and crisis management. I've seen 3 market crashes, 2 major regulatory overhauls, and more corporate restructurings than I care to count. But apparently, that made me a fossil. Here's the thing about corporate politics. You can feel the shift before anyone says a word. I sat there frozen, not because it hurt, though it did, but because I recognized that tone. I'd heard it before during the dot-com crash, during 2008, every time someone young and ambitious decided that experience was just another word for obsolete. The laugh was always the opening shot, and it always ended with someone like me getting pushed aside. By the end of that week, the risk management framework I'd built over 15 years was a crime scene. Dead processes everywhere. Vendor documentation eliminated for efficiency. My budget slashed from $1.8 million to $520,000, nearly a 70% cut. My team of 4 seasoned risk analysts scattered across departments where they now reported to operations managers who thought risk appetite was something you discussed over lunch. Amanda didn't fire me outright. That would have required HR paperwork and exit interviews and all sorts of complications. Instead, she starved the position until it collapsed from within. I still had the title Senior Risk Director, still had my badge access, but no authority, no meetings that mattered, no say in anything that could impact the bottom line. When I did speak up, which wasn't often anymore, I got that corporate smile people give when they think you've forgotten how the world works now. What really got me was how systematic it was. Amanda had clearly done this before, probably at her last 2 consulting gigs. She had a playbook for marginalizing people like me, older employees with institutional knowledge who might push back on her transformation initiatives. I didn't argue, didn't send desperate emails to the CEO or make a scene in Slack. My wife Patricia asked me why I wasn't fighting back, and I told her the same thing I'd learned watching other corporate purges. When someone's decided you're the problem, defending yourself just proves their point. What I did instead was document everything. Every bypassed control, every deleted policy, every risk assessment that got fast-tracked without proper review. I made copies of copies, printed the metadata, stored encrypted files on a thumb drive that never left my locked desk drawer, every email that showed Amanda's team cutting corners, every memo that eliminated mandatory procedures, every client file that got approved without the standard background checks. Because here's what I learned after 22 years in corporate America. Being underestimated gives you all the time in the world to prepare for the day they realize their mistake. And in financial services, that day always comes. The regulators don't care about your velocity initiatives when the audit letters start arriving. Amanda's version of modern operations was basically a confidence game wrapped in MBA buzzwords. She launched something called Velocity Operations, her signature program designed to eliminate friction and reduce bureaucratic drag. Translation: gut the review process and hope nobody asks questions before her next promotion. Her favorite move was cutting mandatory approval steps and calling it streamlining. She turned quarterly risk assessments into optional check-ins, dropped vendor certifications from annual to as needed, eliminated the requirement for dual approval on client onboarding. When someone from legal asked if this complied with FINRA 3110 requirements, Amanda waved it off. Regulations are guidelines, not handcuffs. We need to think bigger. I bit my tongue and kept documenting every memo, every stripped procedure, every Slack thread where I flagged a potential violation and got a thumbs-up emoji in response. I named the folder Regulatory Insurance because I had a feeling someone was going to need comprehensive coverage eventually. The first sign of real trouble came 2 months into Amanda's restructuring. She approved 3 new institutional clients in a single week without the standard enhanced due diligence reviews. These weren't small accounts. We're talking pension funds and retirement systems with hundreds of millions in assets. The kind of clients that require background checks, financial stability screenings, and regulatory disclosure packages that can take weeks to properly review. One of them, Meridian Capital, caught my attention immediately. Their compliance officer had left his previous firm under suspicious circumstances, and they had a pending SEC enforcement action for inadequate record keeping. Exactly the kind of red flag that should have triggered our enhanced screening protocols. I flagged it quietly, sent a note to our compliance team, and copied Amanda. Couldn't locate the enhanced due diligence package for Meridian Capital. Do we have their regulatory disclosure forms and background verification on file? Amanda replied in 8 words. You're the past, Rick. Let progress happen. That one got printed, dated, and filed in a special section I was starting to think of as evidence of willful negligence. Because in financial services, willful negligence isn't just a fireable offense, it can be a criminal one. What I couldn't figure out was whether Amanda genuinely didn't understand the regulatory environment, or if she just didn't care. Either way, she was building a compliance disaster that was going to explode eventually. The only question was whether I'd still be around to help clean up the mess, or if I'd be long gone by the time the regulators showed up asking questions. Turns out, I wouldn't have to wait long to find out. The documentation trail didn't just fray under Amanda's leadership, it completely disintegrated. Every client brought in under her fast-track onboarding program came with missing paperwork, no enhanced due diligence worksheets, no regulatory history reviews, no financial stability screenings that any competent risk officer would require before onboarding institutional clients. I'll tell you what really bothered me. It wasn't just the shortcuts. It was how proud Amanda seemed of them. She'd reference our streamlined processes in board presentations, talking about how we'd eliminated redundant friction points in client acquisition. What she'd actually eliminated were the safeguards that kept us out of regulatory trouble. One client's compliance certification had expired 8 months earlier and still listed the wrong business address. Another hadn't completed our standard FINRA suitability questionnaire, and Amanda's solution was elegant in its simplicity. Let's get them trading and catch up on paperwork later. Later. That word is dynamite in financial services. Later is where the enforcement actions live, where regulatory fines compound, where careers end in congressional hearings. But Amanda wielded later like it was some breakthrough innovation in client service. Every time I brought up a gap in documentation, she'd smile and say, "Rick, you worry too much. We're not splitting atoms here. We're facilitating capital allocation." She had this way of making prudent risk management sound like paranoid micromanagement. I didn't bother explaining that our biggest client, Pinnacle Retirement Systems, managed $400 million in pension funds. We were legally bound to enhance due diligence under ERISA Section 404, buried deep in their service agreement. She wouldn't have listened anyway. Amanda had that consultant's confidence, the kind that comes from fixing other people's companies for 6 months before moving on to the next engagement. Meanwhile, the actual risk infrastructure began to rot from the inside. Review cycles were skipped entirely. Audit logs weren't maintained. Client risk scorecards disappeared from our quarterly reports. The monthly risk committee meetings I'd been running for 8 years, canceled for efficiency. That's when Amanda brought in Kevin Brooks, her golden boy. 26 years old, MBA from Wharton, 3 years at McKinsey before jumping to operations consulting. Sharp kid, I'll give him that. But he looked at our compliance framework like it was some ancient filing system that needed to be digitized and optimized. Kevin's first move was renaming our shared compliance folder from Risk Management Documentation to Ops Excellence Hub. When I asked him about maintaining our SOX 404 audit trails, he looked at me like I'd asked about maintaining our telegraph equipment. You know what else disappeared? Our quarterly backup procedures for client data. Kevin decided we didn't need local redundancy since everything was in the cloud anyway. I tried explaining that regulatory examinations require 7-year data retention with specific recovery protocols, but I got the same smile Amanda gave me, polite, dismissive, slightly confused about why anyone would care about such details. So I started building my own parallel documentation system, not in the cloud, not on shared drives, but in a locked filing cabinet that only I had access to. Air-gapped backup drives, encrypted USB storage, printed copies of every critical document with proper version control. Every time Amanda approved a client without enhanced screening, I saved the original application and documented what procedures had been bypassed. Every time Kevin forwarded me a policy marked final, I compared it against the previous version and archived both. Every email thread where I flagged a regulatory concern and got brushed off went straight into my evidence file. People think risk management is just boring paperwork, but they don't understand what it really is. It's forensic accounting with a regulatory framework. You collect evidence, build timelines, and prepare for the day someone in a government office asks you to explain how your firm operates. And here's the thing about financial services. That day always comes. The markets are cyclical, regulations are constant, and auditors have long memories. Amanda was giving me material faster than I could document it, building what I could only describe as a compliance house of cards while convincing the board it was Fort Knox. I kept my voice low and my objections minimal. But inside I was cataloging every violation like evidence in a federal case because that's probably what it would become eventually. The real acceleration happened around month 4 of Amanda's tenure. She was feeling confident, getting positive feedback from senior management about our improved operational efficiency. Client acquisition was up 40%, processing times were down 60%, and the board loved hearing about our modernized approach to risk assessment. What they didn't hear about were the 12 client files sitting in Kevin's inbox without required regulatory disclosures, or the 3 pension fund clients we'd onboarded without proper e-RESA compliance documentation, or the vendor contracts that had been approved without the mandatory third-party risk assessments. I started staying late, not because anyone asked me to, but because that's when I could access the systems without Kevin or Amanda monitoring what I was reviewing. I'd print out the original client applications, cross-reference them with the abbreviated versions that had actually been processed, and document exactly what due diligence steps had been skipped. The patterns were clear and systematic. Amanda wasn't just cutting corners randomly. She had a specific methodology for bypassing our most important safeguards while maintaining the appearance of proper procedures. It was almost impressive in its thoroughness. But the thing about regulatory compliance is that it's binary. You're either compliant or you're not. There's no partial credit for efficiency improvements when you're missing mandatory documentation during an examination. I remember the exact moment I realized how bad things had gotten. I was reviewing our client risk database and noticed that 23 of our institutional accounts, representing over $800 million in assets, had been approved in the past 6 months with incomplete due diligence packages. 23. In a properly functioning risk management system, even one incomplete file would trigger a comprehensive review. That night, I went home and told Patricia that I thought we were heading for serious regulatory trouble. She asked if I should warn someone, maybe try to fix things before they got worse. I explained that I'd already tried multiple times and been told I was stuck in the past. Sometimes the best thing you can do is document everything and wait for reality to catch up with optimism. In financial services, reality always wins eventually. The regulatory examination notice hit our compliance inbox like a lightning strike on a clear day. I was at my desk on a Tuesday morning when I saw the email from the SEC's Asset Management Division. Joint Regulatory Examination, SEC and FINRA. 90-day look back on client onboarding procedures. 5 business day response window for all documentation requests. 5 business days. To prepare for a full-scope regulatory audit covering our entire client acquisition process over the past 3 months. Every background check, every risk assessment, every piece of documentation that separated us from a consent order and potential multi-million-dollar fines. My phone stayed silent. My calendar remained empty. No emergency meeting invite, no urgent call from Amanda, no mention of my involvement. That told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in the new organizational structure. I watched from the sidelines as Amanda reacted exactly the way people like her always do when reality shows up uninvited. She called an all-hands meeting, cracked jokes about regulatory theater, and assured everyone that we just needed to package our existing processes professionally. "Look, they do these examinations all the time," she said, standing at the front of our main conference room. "It's basically a compliance audit with government letterhead. We document what we're already doing, show them our streamlined processes, and they check their boxes. Kevin's got this handled." Kevin nodded enthusiastically, already pulling up a Google Slides presentation he'd apparently started working on during the meeting. The kid had confidence, I'll give him that. Unfortunately, confidence doesn't generate missing documentation. She assigned the entire response to Kevin and 2 junior analysts who'd been with the firm for less than a year. Their first move was creating what Kevin called a regulatory response war room in our largest conference space, complete with whiteboards, sticky notes, and energy drinks. They kicked things off by announcing they'd knock this out like a consulting engagement and started building timelines on colorful poster boards. A consulting engagement for a federal examination that could potentially shut down our operations. I stayed out of it visibly. No objections, no offers to help, because helping would mean co-signing a disaster in progress. Instead, I kept my head down and listened to their frantic planning sessions from my corner office. The gaps became obvious within hours. They'd mixed up client files, lost track of approval workflows, and couldn't locate half the due diligence packages that Amanda's team had supposedly completed. When they looked for our enhanced screening procedures for retirement fund clients, Kevin discovered that most of the documentation existed only as checkbox entries in a spreadsheet. "Where are the actual ERISA compliance forms?" I heard him ask during one of their sessions. "I think those got simplified during the process optimization," someone replied. Simplified. That's what they were calling the systematic elimination of mandatory regulatory procedures. By day 3, panic was setting in. I could hear it in their voices as they worked late into the evening, trying to reconstruct 6 months of missing compliance documentation. Kevin had dark circles under his eyes and was surviving on coffee and determination. Amanda set up what she called a regulatory excellence workspace in our main conference room, complete with motivational posters and a countdown clock. She even brought in catered lunch and posed for photos with the team, everyone smiling like they were launching a product instead of trying to avoid federal sanctions. I walked past that room once and heard Kevin say, "We can probably just use a template from the previous audit and update the dates. They're not going to compare every signature. Wrong. Dead wrong." This wasn't some routine compliance review. According to the letter, the examination had been triggered by a whistleblower complaint about our client screening practices. The SEC and FINRA weren't looking for paperwork compliance, they were hunting for evidence of systematic regulatory avoidance. The lead examiner was going to be Patricia Williams from the SEC's Enforcement Division. I'd heard her name in industry circles. 15 years of experience, reputation for thoroughness, and a track record of asking the kind of detailed questions that made compliance officers wake up in cold sweats. What Kevin and his team didn't understand was that experienced regulators don't just review what you give them. They cross-reference everything. Check dates against workflows, verify signatures against authorization records. They look for patterns that indicate willful non-compliance versus accidental oversights. I knew what was coming. The timelines wouldn't match. The signatures wouldn't align with approval dates. The due diligence packages would reveal themselves as hastily assembled fiction created after the fact. And Amanda, still making jokes about bureaucratic box checking, had no idea she was about to walk into a federal examination with blank ammunition. Here's what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I hadn't just kept copies of the original documents. I'd maintained complete audit trails showing who had changed what, when they'd made the changes, and what mandatory procedures they'd bypassed to make it happen. Every email where Amanda had overruled compliance requirements, every memo where Kevin had eliminated redundant verification steps, every client file that had been fast-tracked without proper regulatory review. I had the metadata, the version histories, the electronic signatures that would show exactly when corners had been cut and who had authorized the shortcuts. Because this was never about saving my job or getting revenge on Amanda. This was about protecting the firm from the consequences of willful regulatory negligence. And in financial services, those consequences aren't just financial. They can be criminal. The night before the examination, I did something I'd never done before in 22 years of corporate compliance work. I went home and told Patricia that there was a good chance I'd be spending the next several weeks helping federal regulators understand how our risk management systems actually worked. "Are you in trouble?" she asked. "No," I said, "but Amanda is about to be." The examination team was scheduled to arrive Thursday morning at 9 a.m. I set my alarm for 6:30, made sure my documentation files were properly organized, and went to bed early. Tomorrow was going to be a very long day, and I wanted to be ready when the regulators started asking questions that Kevin couldn't answer. Sometimes in corporate life, you spend years building systems and processes that you hope you'll never need to use. But when that day comes, when the auditors arrive and start asking the hard questions, you want to be the person with the right answers, not the person scrambling to create them. I had a feeling I was about to find out which category I fell into. The examination team didn't storm in like federal agents making arrests. They arrived like accountants with badges, quiet, methodical, and carrying the kind of thick binders that meant someone's day was about to get very complicated. Patricia Williams, the lead examiner, was a compact woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and the unhurried confidence of someone who'd seen every excuse in the regulatory playbook. She didn't waste time with small talk or pleasantries. She looked directly at Amanda and said, "We'll start with your enhanced due diligence procedures for institutional clients, beginning with the Meridian Capital onboarding file." Meridian Capital, the client I'd flagged 4 months ago, the one with pending SEC enforcement actions that should have triggered enhanced screening protocols. Amanda's smile flickered for just a second before she launched into full charm mode. "Absolutely. We're excited to walk you through our streamlined client acquisition framework. We've achieved remarkable efficiency in our onboarding processes while maintaining full regulatory compliance." Williams didn't look impressed. She opened her binder and consulted a typed sheet. "We'd prefer to see the actual documentation, complete file, from initial contact through final approval, including all required FINRA 3110 supervisory procedures." The conference room went quiet except for the sound of Kevin frantically typing into his laptop like he could manifest the missing files through sheer keyboard activity. "We can definitely provide a comprehensive overview today," Amanda said, her voice still confident but with a slight edge creeping in, "and then follow up with any supporting materials you might need." "We need the original documents now," Williams replied. "Enhanced due diligence worksheets, background verification reports, regulatory disclosure forms, and the completed suitability analysis. These are standard requirements for institutional accounts." I was sitting at the far end of the table, essentially invisible. Nobody had introduced me to the examination team. I hadn't spoken a word. But I noticed Williams glance in my direction when Amanda stumbled over a question about ERISA compliance procedures, like she'd already reviewed our organizational charts and knew who used to handle risk management. Kevin passed out folders that were too thin and too new. The covers were printed on glossy paper that still had that fresh from the printer smell. Williams and her team flipped through the contents with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this hundreds of times before. "Who prepared this client risk assessment?" Williams asked, tapping a section labeled Institutional Suitability Analysis. Kevin raised his hand like he was back in business school. "That was me, based on information from Amanda and our updated procedural framework." "Which specific procedures did you follow?" Kevin hesitated, glancing at Amanda. "We used our streamlined approach, focusing on the essential compliance elements while eliminating redundant steps." Silence. Williams made notes in her binder. No questions, no encouragement, just the sound of a federal examiner documenting what would likely become evidence in an enforcement proceeding. Amanda tried to redirect. "Of course, if there are any clarifications needed, we're happy to provide additional context in our follow-up materials." "Let's proceed to the Pinnacle Retirement Onboarding File," Williams said without looking up. "This involves ERISA-governed pension assets, so we'll need to see your fiduciary compliance procedures and the mandatory enhanced screening documentation." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. ERISA compliance. The procedures Amanda had eliminated as unnecessarily complex during her operational restructuring. I watched Amanda's face cycle through confusion, recognition, and barely controlled panic. She turned to Kevin, who looked like someone had just asked him to perform cardiac surgery with a butter knife. "We've modernized those procedures recently," Amanda said, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "Simplified the documentation requirements for greater operational efficiency." Williams finally looked up from her notes. "Ma'am, these aren't optional procedures. ERISA Section 404 requires specific fiduciary safeguards for pension fund assets. Who designed your current compliance framework?" Silence. I sipped my coffee and said nothing, watching Amanda realize that her streamlined processes had eliminated federally mandated protections for retirement assets. "The framework predates our current operational structure," Amanda said, "but the compliance objectives have remained consistent with regulatory requirements." "We're not interested in objectives," Williams said. "We need documentation showing exactly how you verify ERISA compliance for pension fund clients, original procedures, approval workflows, and supervisory review records for the past 6 months. Kevin was frantically scrolling through files on his laptop. Amanda kept glancing toward the door like she was considering making a run for it. The other examination team members were taking notes and making periodic comments to each other in voices too low to hear. That's when Williams said the words that changed everything. "Mr. Caldwell." The room went completely still. Every head turned toward me like I'd just been called as a surprise witness in a murder trial. "You handled risk management and regulatory compliance prior to the operational restructuring, correct?" Amanda jumped in before I could respond. Actually, Rick's role was more administrative support. He's no longer involved in current operations or client procedures. Williams held up a hand, her eyes never leaving mine. "Mr. Caldwell, according to our records, you were the primary author of the ERISA compliance procedures from 2019 through earlier this year. That includes the enhanced screening protocols for the Pinnacle retirement account." I stood up slowly, walked to the end of the table, and set down my coffee cup. "Would it be helpful if I provided the complete regulatory compliance documentation? Original procedures, revision history, and all client files with proper due diligence records through last month?" Williams nodded once. "That would be very helpful, Mr. Caldwell." I walked to my office, unlocked my filing cabinet, and retrieved the comprehensive folder I'd been maintaining for 8 months. Every bypassed procedure, every eliminated safeguard, every client file that should have triggered enhanced review but didn't. When I returned to the conference room, the silence was absolute. I placed the folder on the table with the same care I'd use handling evidence in a federal courtroom. Williams opened it and began reviewing the contents. Page after page of properly completed forms, detailed risk assessments, comprehensive background checks, and documented supervisory reviews. Everything Amanda's team couldn't produce because they'd never actually done the work. "This appears to be complete documentation for all institutional accounts," Williams said, making notes. "Exactly what we requested." Amanda was staring at the folder like it contained photographic evidence of a crime, which, from a regulatory perspective, it basically did. The examination concluded 2 hours later. Williams thanked me personally for my cooperation and said someone from their office would be in touch if they needed additional information. I said I'd be available. Amanda didn't say anything. Kevin had stopped typing and was staring at his laptop screen like it might provide answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. The enforcement action came down 3 weeks later, $12 million in fines for systematic failures in client screening and supervisory procedures. Amanda was terminated within 48 hours for material deficiencies in regulatory oversight. Kevin was reassigned to a junior analyst position with mandatory compliance training. I got a call from our CEO asking if I'd consider the Chief Risk Officer position. New title, a $180,000 salary increase, expanded authority, and a board mandate that all operational changes required my approval before implementation. My first official act was implementing what I called the Regulatory Integrity Protocol, mandatory documentation for all client onboarding, quarterly compliance audits, and zero tolerance for procedural shortcuts, regardless of operational efficiency concerns. Some people complained about the new requirements. Others adapted. But the smart ones started listening more carefully when I talked about regulatory obligations and the cost of non-compliance. I still keep that filing cabinet locked, not out of paranoia but out of principle. Because in corporate America, the people who pay attention to details and follow proper procedures aren't the ones who get recognition until something goes wrong. But when the regulators come knocking and start asking hard questions, you want to be the person with complete documentation and clean procedures, not the person trying to explain why efficiency was more important than compliance. And sometimes, just sometimes, quiet competence gets the recognition it deserves.